So the Second World War, today we're going to talk about barbarism in the Second World War and how we've got a combination of military might, industrial power, and racist ideology that's going to all combine in the same conflict to in terms in front. We've got to make sure we can make a distinction, just like we did in the First World War, between the war in the West and the war in the East. We're going to do the same in the Second World War. The Eastern Front will bear the brunt of the civilian casualties. And we have this question as well, because countries before the Second World War have worked out agreements about rules for warfare. There have been a number of conferences held in Geneva, Switzerland, even before the Second World War, a couple of them coming after the First. Where there was some recognition that the nature of warfare changed. Warfare used to be seen as this chivalrous action between two armies on an open battlefield. But the First World War brought new technologies and death and destruction, and the targeting of civilians like never seen before, like when the Germans were marching through Belgium, and the treatment of Belgian civilians by the German army. This was unprecedented beforehand. So after the First World War, nations met with each other. Remember, the climate of the 1920s was to make sure atrocities like the First World War never happened again. So they met with each other, and agreements were made. Agreements regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. For example, if I am at battle with your nation, or I'm at war with your nation, and I take some of your soldiers prisoner, I am obliged, according to agreements made in Geneva, Switzerland, to take care of your prisoners, to give them shelter, to feed them, to make sure they're adequately clothed, to give them medical treatment if necessary.
Not torture them.
With the idea, and of course not torture, with the idea that during this war, you will likely be taking my prisoners as well. And I would want the same treatment for my prisoners. And as soon as we finish this conflict, the prisoners all can go home, right, and live the rest of their lives. And by the same notion, civilians should not be targeted within warfare. War should be between uniformed armies. War should not be taken to civilian populations. But the Second World War changes this in a lot of respect. First, we have a Nazi ideology that sees the German race as a superior race to all others in the world, but certainly superior to their neighbors to their east in Slavic people and the Jewish race in Eastern Europe. And in fact, part of Hitler's plan, his acquisition of Lebensraum to feed his greater Germany, called for a plan that he called Generalplan Ost. It's the General Plan East, which called for essentially the colonization of Eastern Europe by German people, which would be preceded by the eradication of populations in Eastern Europe. So there was absolutely a plan that the Germans, the Nazis, had for genocide in Eastern Europe. And they started carrying this program out as they invaded into Poland and then following certainly into the Soviet Union. So when we combine the ideology of the Nazi Party, when we combine the military capabilities of armies in this war, and then we also combine a blurred line between what is civilian and what is soldier, all right? We can all understand soldiers wear uniforms and they fight on front lines. But in the Second World War, which is such an industrial war never, to this extent, never seen before, do the civilians at home who are working in factories, being encouraged by their government with the same propaganda that we looked at yesterday, to work in those factories and make the armaments that can be shipped to the front lines, are they as responsible for the war as the soldiers on the front lines? This is a rhetorical question. You guys, I don't know that we can answer this immediately. They don't wear uniforms. They go home at the end of the day to their families, but they might work in armaments plants. Or are the farmers that are going out and sowing the fields? who are providing the food for the nation, some of which goes to the front line, some of it which feeds those industrial workers that are feeding the soldiers on the front lines, the armaments of war. Are they still civilians? In the Second World War, it was largely deemed those were viable military targets. Industrial centers, all right, armaments factories, those became viable targets in war. Huh?
Those still are.
Those still are. We haven't really fought a war like the Second World War. Maybe some aspects of Vietnam, but
And Korea.
yeah, those are different in just a lot of respects. But anyway, we're gonna press on, and let's talk about those other wars, and then we'll see how well those comparisons still sit. So the point is, all nations that are fighting this war saw military necessity start to erode the idea of civilian non-combatants. And so the Second World War will bring more civilian casualties, more civilian deaths than any war previously. We also have the reality of the resistance to German occupation and invasion, especially in Eastern Europe, often met with the wholesale destruction of villages. Here is a small village in France that was seen by German officials as being complicit in the French resistance movement against Nazi occupation. And so it was ordered that every civilian be killed and every building be destroyed in the city. And this is one artifact that France kept. Oh, pardon. This is one artifact that France kept, just as it was left in the Second World War, as a remembrance of the French resistance movement and how the Nazis reacted to that. Which is another interesting story, which we'll talk about in a moment. You've got two sides in France. You've got a resistance movement, an active resistance movement, that is striking against Nazi occupation and sometimes being destroyed by Nazi occupation. And then you've got the mass of France that collaborates, that accepts, or that just kind of keeps living their lives, in some cases aids the Nazis in France to meet their goals in France. France has done a lot of work over recent years to remember more of this than they want to remember the collaboration side. You have a lot of museums in France to remember the resistance movement. There aren't like Vichy France museums to remember the collaborators. For obvious reasons. Why would a nation want to remember the darker side of their own history? But in the East, where racial ideology drives much of Nazi actions, that's where we're going to see the majority of destruction. Now, this one village, obviously this is just one of hundreds of villages and cities that are going to be destroyed during this combat. Aerial bombing, obviously, is going to wreak havoc on German cities and cities throughout Europe. Anybody recognize what this city is? Just by maybe one of the main landmark in it? No, not Paris. Paris wouldn't be this hit. No. This is in Germany? Say it, sir? Now say it normally. Cologne, very good. Just out of curiosity, what do Germans call like the cologne as in like male smelling enhancers? Is that as well? No. Okay. Parfum? I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, this is Cologne, Germany. All right? This is the very famous Cologne Cathedral. It was built, I think, in the late 19th century. And you can see that this is going to be stricken by aerial bombing from the Allies, and the city is going to be virtually destroyed. The city is going to be virtually destroyed. And the bridge is absolutely gone. This, you guys can't, of course, recognize this city, but this is, anybody want to take a guess? This is Warsaw in Poland. It's the capital of Poland. You almost can't make it out that it was ever a city. It looks almost like one of those things that we stare at it for long enough, something is going to pop out in like 3D image. The city is virtually destroyed. And remember, Poland goes through arguably the worst story in World War II. At the outset of the war in September of '39, you get the Nazis and the Germans, you get the Germans and the Soviets invading simultaneously. And then 2 years later, in June of '41, when the Soviets are invaded by Nazi Germany. Poland is the beginning of that fight because the Germans have to march themselves through Poland. And let me run back really quickly to a previous image. As the Nazis made their way back through former Soviet-occupied Poland, they come across a mass burial in what's called the Katyn Forest. The Katyn Forest, where 20,000 Polish officers and Polish political leaders were taken to the forest by the Soviets and executed and buried in a shallow mass grave. And the Nazis found this. And the Nazis, crazy enough, would use this story of the Katyn Forest massacre as proof that the Soviets were bad and that they needed to be defeated in the war, despite the fact that the Nazis themselves will be leaving mass graves throughout Eastern Europe. All right. Now, of course, the Soviets are going to deny this, say, no, this wasn't us, this was the Nazis, because they're the ones leaving mass graves everywhere. And it would only be within the last few years that the Russian government officially acknowledged this happened, this was perpetrated by the Soviets, and they officially apologized to Poland for that. So that's the Katyn Forest massacre. Just another example of countless examples of horrible acts against humanity during the Second World War. Let's go to another image. So this is Warsaw. I said Warsaw is going to be obviously attacked first by the Nazi Blitzkrieg in 1939. Then the war marches back through as the Germans invade the Soviet Union. But then a couple years later, as the Germans start to be pushed back by the Soviets, and as the Soviets drive the German armies back towards Germany, where must they go through again? Poland again. In the midst of all of that, the city of Warsaw, a portion of the city of Warsaw, becomes the largest ghetto in the Second World War for Jews of Poland and Jews of Eastern Europe. So the Warsaw Ghetto, and we'll talk more about this when we deal with the Holocaust, the Warsaw Ghetto is a section of the city where Jews from Eastern Europe, primarily Poland, were funneled into to keep them in one place. Through the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, a resistance movement would arise inside the ghetto, and the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto attempted to rise up against the Nazi occupiers, which again brought more death and destruction inside the city of Warsaw. So you can't even recognize that as an opportunity. And Brian, have you been to Warsaw? Anybody in here been to Warsaw? I'm just curious. No. I'm just, a lot of these European cities. Have you been to Cologne, sir? Yeah. You lived. Oh, you lived there. Oh, so you absolutely recognize it. Okay. And so I would have to imagine that it looks today to be a very modern city, because
I mean, it's still like the older Cologne, so they tried to like refurbish and like recreate all the buildings.
So there was some refurbishment and rebuilding that was done.
The cathedral itself is still refreshed.
Put together. Okay. Okay. Excellent. Anybody recognize this? Yes, sir. Stalingrad. Yeah, I think we talked about that movie at the Gates, and I think you would have seen this in there. So this is a statue, and this is little kids playing that classic Russian game, Ring Around the Crocodile, it seems. But anyway, this is a statue in Stalingrad, and what a powerful picture this is. A statue of children, and they are all obviously, smoldered and smudged from the war. I don't even know if smoldered is a word, but we're going to use it right now. And the city burns behind it. Stalingrad was virtually destroyed as the city became the center of that battle that we talked about being the turning point of the Second World War. So cities completely destroyed. This is not even to mention what was going on in Japan. We've already talked about it.
That's a baby. I mean, no, it's not on the statue. It's
on
the street.
Right there.
It's the street.
Yeah, I don't know if that's an actual child. That's a good catch. I have to look into this picture some more.
That's a baby.
Literal child.
I wonder if that is like some part of the statue that is
No,
now
that's
just
part
over
of the street. That's on the
I know it's on the street, but it may not have originated on the street. Can't imagine that's a little child, but that if it is, that makes this even worse.
Take a picture.
Anyway, we press on. These images are only a fraction. We talked last week about what was going on in Japan. Obviously, the droppings of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and then before that, the bombing of dozens of Japanese cities. The firebombing of dozens of Japanese cities, like Operation Meeting House in April of 1945, right? In Tokyo. We'll talk more about the Holocaust specifically in a couple moments. Now I want to spend a minute talking about the collaboration and resistance movements within Nazi-occupied Europe. When we talk about collaboration and we talk about resistance, we are going to be dealing with a lot of nuance here as well. Sorry about this. Too many rough images, guys. When we talk about collaboration and resistance, we'll talk about this unfortunate woman in a moment here. When we talk about collaboration and resistance, we want to understand that there is going to be a spectrum, I think we would want to think of on one side, absolute resistance to Nazi occupation, and on the other side, absolute collaboration with Nazi occupation. All right? And then every shade in between. So throughout the war, we will see collaborators, especially in the West, especially, for example, in France, or in the Netherlands, or in Denmark, or eventually in Norway. In these nations in the West that could look to the example of Poland in the East and see what happens when a nation truly resists the occupation by the Nazis. And they say, well, wait a minute. Like if we're French, Adolf Hitler doesn't really see us as subhuman. He doesn't have in his plans like the eventual eradication of all Frenchmen or of all Norwegians or of all Swedes or anything like that. So if we can like just kind of keep living our lives, that's maybe not a bad thing. Or some would even go so far, like Marshal Pétain in Vichy, France, some would even go so far to do exactly what the Nazis were ordering you to do. You want us to round up the Jews of France and ship them to the East? Absolutely, we will do that. So you get those collaborators that are actually actively helping Nazi occupation, all right? This picture here, in 1 second, Emily, this picture here is of a woman, a French woman, after World War II, after the Allies had liberated France, and the community saw her as somebody that collaborated and aided the Nazis. And I don't know of her particular story, and there's a lot of pictures like this on the internet. Here's another one, and just colorized, where maybe she hung out at bars that Nazi officers and Nazi soldiers were drinking at, or maybe she was seen dancing with Nazis. Who knows? Who knows? But this would happen throughout France and throughout Nazi-occupied Europe to those who were seen as collaborators after, of course, the liberation came. All right, and so public shaming, and if you have a woman now with a shaved head, it's almost like wearing like the scarlet letter. Everybody would know what you have been accused of doing. So you've got those collaborators. And I think we need to be a little bit careful to do too much judging of this, because it's so hard for us to connect to that situation at the time, where you would fit on this. I think we'd all like to hope and believe that we would have been a part of the active resistance movement. But until the rubber meets the road and you're put in this kind of situation, I think France proves that most French people were perfectly willing to just go on living their own lives and trying to take care of their own families than to actively resist against the Nazis. So you've got those collaborators that are like actively helping the Nazis. And then as we take a step towards the resistance side of the room, we've got those people that just want to keep living their lives. They're not helping the Nazis. They're not harming the Nazis. They're just trying to live their lives. All right? Some might see them, and we might classify them as collaborators because they're not actively doing anything to stop the Nazis. But they're not doing anything to aid the Nazis as well. And then we keep going further and further, and now maybe we start to get the touch of resistance. Maybe, you know, if you're being made to do something by some Nazi officer, you do it slowly, all right? Or you maybe purposely do it wrong. Or maybe you are actively trying to hide Jews in your home or in your town, all right? And this would happen in every nation that not, you know, we all know the story of Anne Frank, but there are thousands of Anne Franks. There are thousands of families that are going to be taking their Jewish neighbors in at their own personal risk. Anne Frank is the one where we have the words of her, though, and so we know what she was going through those days.
The edited version written by her dad.
Sure. This is going to happen throughout the occupied Europe. And then we keep going further, and we keep going further, and now we start to have resistance movements that are not only like trying to make things, or not work with the Nazis, or trying to maybe disobey at times, or trying to hide some Jews, but now maybe we have like an active resistance movement that will take up arms. And here's a couple soldiers within the French resistance. And you actually see a young woman that has taken up arms. So throughout France, for example, there will be an active resistance movement. It won't be as large as we're going to see in Eastern Europe, for obvious reasons we'll talk about in a second, but there will be an active resistance movement. French citizens, maybe former French soldiers that are still on the mainland, that don't want the Nazis to win. And they are now like actively fighting against Nazi occupation. They will do a lot of sabotage, trying to destroy French or German rail lines, German radio lines, German telegraph lines. Maybe they're actively opening fire on German officers and German soldiers. All right? So there is an active resistance movement. The French resistance movement, though, will pale in comparison to the resistance that we see in Eastern Europe. And this shouldn't be surprising, because it is in Eastern Europe that Adolf Hitler absolutely wants to eradicate populations. In France, remember, Adolf Hitler, like, you can go live your life as a Frenchman in Nazi-occupied Europe. All right? If you live in Paris, you can keep living in Paris and go to restaurants in Paris and keep living your life. If you live in Poland, you know that if your life is still around today, it might not be tomorrow if the Nazis ultimately win. So there's going to be a much more active resistance movement in Poland, in Yugoslavia, in Eastern European countries against the Nazis, because you must resist or you die, right? Here's some Jewish resistance in Yugoslavia. So, and you can see it's kind of fitting. They're just in a forest, and they've got their arms, but they don't look like as organized a military as we would see like an American army or a German army looking like, because they don't have those kind of resources. These are groups that would become known as partisans, especially in Yugoslavia. We refer to the partisans of Yugoslavia, who are actively throughout the war going to be resisting Nazi occupation through military force. They don't have the organization or the resources of major military powers, but it's still going to be happening. And it will be quite successful. In Yugoslavia, partisans in Yugoslavia, led by this man in the middle, we've already mentioned him, that's Tito, T-I-T-O, Joseph Broz Tito, who will eventually be the communist leader of Yugoslavia. The resistance movement in Yugoslavia, for example, is so successful that the resistance, the partisans themselves, will drive the Nazis out of Yugoslavia. The Soviets don't have to go into Yugoslavia to liberate that country. And that's going to make a different story for Yugoslavia going forward in the Cold War. I want to close by looking here. This is just a graphic of the overall losses in the Second World War. And we've got a lot of things going on this chart. First, these numbers represent millions of people. They also represent a percentage of population. And then we've got the little red line for military deaths and the green line for civilian deaths. And when you put them together, you get total deaths. And then this bluish line is a total death as a percentage of the nation's population. And that's where we start getting some really stark numbers. And I'll explain as we go through. let me talk first, and then we'll go. So you see a country like us. We have a little red line, no green line. Fortunately, no civilians lost in the Second World War for the United States. This really kind of insignificant red line for the United States hardly looks like anything. It's about 400,000 guys. All right? So this is like nothing on this whole map, or on this whole chart. It's 400,000 men. All right? During our Vietnam War, which was like our last major military operation that the United States fought in, we were there actively fighting for almost 10 years, and we lost about 60,000 guys. And Vietnam is like seen as one of the darkest wars in American history. World War II, the United States lost 400,000 guys. This is no small fight. But no civilians. And you can see an overall very small percentage of our population. Then we look at the Soviet Union. Massive military losses in the Soviet Union. Massive, even more civilian losses in the Soviet Union. We talked about St. Petersburg or Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad, and how that population would go from over 3 million to about down to 500,000 because of the starvation of the siege of Leningrad. And that was almost 14% of the total Soviet population. Or we look at Poland. In Poland, hardly any military losses. The Polish army was defeated very quickly at the beginning of the war. But a massive loss of civilian life. But when you look at that in terms of the percentage of that nation's population, it is approaching 20%. All right? So if the United States today went through what Poland went through in the Second World War on a per capita basis, we'd be talking about 65, 70 million deaths, which is just unconscionable. Unconscionable, that's the word. In Asia, China. Obviously, China's going to fight the duration of the war against the Japanese, so they've got a lot of military deaths against the Japanese, but massive, well over 10, 15 million civilian deaths in China. Relatively small percentage of the massive Chinese population compared to other nations, but unconscionable civilian deaths. If we look, though, where these blue lines are the longest, Latvia, where's that? Eastern Europe. It's one of those Baltic states on the Baltic Sea that the Soviet Union first took over and then the Nazis came in. Latvia. Greece, we of course know, is a country in southeastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Lithuania. Again, Lithuania is just to the south of Latvia. French Indochina is Vietnam. Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe. Poland, obviously Eastern Europe.
India?
The Soviet Union. Why is India there? You've got that many civilian populations in India.
There's actually maybe there were some Japanese expeditionary forces. I don't know.
Yeah,
would they consider their combatants civilian because they weren't?
No, they would. No, I'm not as familiar with that. Good question. Now I want to look into that. Yeah.
With all of the fire bombings, and also the nuclear bombings that the U.S.
Yeah.
Japan, doesn't their civilian death seem kind of small?
Their civilian death does seem kind of small, but then again, we have to remember that this is like 2 million, this is 4 million. So that little nub of civilian deaths in Japan is approaching 1 million civilian deaths. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, between the two of them, were probably about 130,000. Between the two of them.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say that it's actually about 500,000, not approaching 1 million would be the half.
Yeah, I said approaching 1 million. Anyway, there's that. Anyway, okay, regardless. Yeah, it does seem like not as dramatic as what other nations are going through, absolutely. So I think this puts it in stark terms. At the very end of today, we're going to watch something else that I think is going to put those numbers in more stark terms. Any questions, comments, concerns from anybody? All right. I'd like to take a quick break.